Okay, welcome everyone. With a little bit of delay, we can start this kickoff. We can kick off this session on facing the megatrends, spatial justice and just transition. My name is Joachim Maas. I work for the European Commission, DG Regio, in also the unit that organizes this conference, or the unit on policy development and economic analysis. I worked there since 1 year. Before, I was a scientist at the Joint Research Center, mainly working on biodiversity. Clearly, leaving no one behind, as stated before, is a key objective of the European Green Deal. As soon as the von der Leyen Commission entered into force in 2019, the European Green Deal was launched in soon after, clearly with also the target of a just transition to climate neutrality, and then hence taken also up in the cohesion policy. So the discussions on today focus on this just transition. We have 3 speakers today, actually 4 speakers. We start the session with Sarah. After that, we have Mike, and then Mikko and Michael. We have 1.5 hours. There's only 3 presentations, so you will have 20 minutes each to present. After each presentation, I just open the floor for 1 or 2 technical or specific questions that you might have, and otherwise we have a common discussion also later. Sort of interest. I'm fairly interested also to understand, and already mentioned before in the plenary, how can we ensure that also in the next cohesion policy we leave no one behind? What is the effectiveness of the current instruments? Is there a risk for fragmentation? So these are the kind of questions that I would also like to address with you after this session. So I now then invite Sarah Kaitsuka to the floor. She is a PhD student at the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. Sarah.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So I'll be presenting on my paper on just transition. Excuse me, with the presentation. Oh, this one? Second one. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Oh. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. So my paper is titled Just Transition, How to Leave No One Behind, a lesson from comparative analysis of the British coal mines and the Croatian oil refinery. To start off with, the definition of a just transition, according to the European Commission, as mentioned before, is a transition towards a climate neutral economy, but with a caveat that it happens in a fair way, leaving no one behind. And some of the policy implications from that is that it needs to be a place-based interventions to minimize negative socioeconomic impacts stemming from transition into a sustainable economy. So the concept of the just transition itself actually has a fairly old background. So it derives from the 1980s trade union movement within the United States. At this moment in time, it was predominantly as a move against the people losing jobs from the manufacturing sector and then transitioning into the service sector. However, fast forward to present, the terminology just transition has expanded to include the replacement of non-green jobs and into transition into green jobs. So in terms of the kind of specific features that the green jobs have, they tend to have be non-routine tasks, require formal education and on-the-job training. So it does imply that people would need to have a higher level of human capital in order to make the most of the green jobs. There's also been talks about how there needs to be more local level support and having key stakeholders being involved in order to make this transition a success. So going to the question of who's actually responsible for just transition, previous studies have found that EU citizens are capable of placing responsibility depending on the policy area. So for instance, if your healthcare system is nationalized, they'll be more likely to perceive the national government as being responsible, and therefore they are able to differentiate between who's responsible for each policy area. And also decentralization has been found to have greater positive economic impact, whether that's economic growth or a fairer economy, and therefore decentralization is also quite key. And going back to the previous statement, people are still capable of placing responsibility where they are the greatest. However, the caveat to this is that people need to be well informed constantly in order to make a good judgment as well. Okay, so in terms of the areas I'm focusing on, I don't know if you can tell from my accent, I'm actually situated in Yorkshire. So that's why that circle is showing Wakefield region, which is in West Yorkshire. As you can see, it's in a centralized location. And then the comparison that I wanted to do was with Sisak in Croatia, which is located there. Now, I'd like to caveat that this paper has been mainly presented from my own thesis, which focused on Wakefield specifically. So Sisak would, with the case of Sisak, I'll be trying to extract some lessons that can be learned from the case of Wakefield rather than a direct comparison. Okay, so in terms of some of the similarities, both regions are carbon-intensive, place-based industries. With the case of Sisak in Croatia, they used to have an oil refinery. Now it has closed down, and now they're trying to transition into biorefinery. In the case of Wakefield, it used to be a traditional coal mining area, and it has also been quite reliant on this mono industry for a long time. Both regions face issues in the sense of skills and education qualification levels, which tend to be a bit lower than the national average. Key differences are stated there, but I think that with some of the similarities there, I can extract some of the lessons that can be learned from the case of Wakefield. So in terms of just transition, I think with the previous studies that has been done with the original intention of from people losing their jobs and then being retrained or re-educated into new jobs, I think we can apply this to the just transition from non-green jobs. Probably people become unemployed, then they'll need to be retrained and then gain green jobs. So it's sort of policy. The process is a linear process. And in terms of policy implications, you have perhaps different policy interventions at each stage of this linear progress. What I would say is that having these disparate policies would mean that it would be quite likely that people will be falling between the cracks between these in each transition process. So focusing on the point of unemployment, I don't think I'll be very new to say that they have quite substantive negative impacts. But the most important thing that these negative impacts of unemployment tends to be multi-generational, as in if the previous generation of the family becomes unemployed, it is less likely for you to find a job as well. And the period of having unemployment means that you'll be losing key skills, as well as you'll be more reliant on higher human capital, such as skills and networks. So these are the kinds of caveats that exist, and therefore I'd argue that the linear process of non-green jobs to becoming unemployed, successful retraining, and then becoming re-employed in green sectors is going to be quite a challenge. So I'll skip this bit just for now. Okay, so going to Wakefield as a case study, it closed 16 total mines, but the majority of this 11 mines were closed between the 1980s and the 1990s, resulting in substantive job losses and population decline. It has started to improve in terms of population, which is growing at the moment, but we are seeing an aging population at the moment. So the important thing is that the jobs that came after the mine closures, they tended to be low paid, low skilled, tended to be routine work, and mostly found in the logistics sector. And this is because Wakefield is situated in the middle of the country, and therefore it has been identified that probably would prosper with a focus on logistics sector. But that also means that there's lack of skills and lack of diverse opportunities. We also have limited re-education opportunities because we don't have any universities in the area. If you want to go to university, you're more likely to move out or commute long distances. And we have Wakefield College, which does offer degree level apprenticeships, but these positions tend to be quite minimal in scale. And I'd like to point out that despite the image of coal mining as being an arduous work and probably quite poor, they tended to pay quite well in the past. So it was the second highest median pay as of 1980 for full-time male workers in the manufacturing sector. So I'd like to point out that the kind of jobs that people lost weren't necessarily just bad or arduous. It was relatively well paid for the region, and therefore the shock of the new jobs that came to be, which tended to be lower skills, had a devastating impact as well. Okay, so I'd like to also focus on the acrimonious relationships between key stakeholders. We've been talking about the importance of key stakeholders having an aligned interest. In the case of Wakefield, during the 1980s, Thatcher government and the National Coal Board had the intention of closing the mines, potentially supporting people who become unemployed, retrain them, and then help them into re-employment. However, the National Union of Miners, which was the trade unions, disagreed with this and wanted to keep all mines open regardless of its economic capacity, and therefore save coal mining jobs. I also like to point out with the Thatcher government, they were quite interested in entrepreneurships, meaning that they wanted to invest in people becoming entrepreneurs in the area, which was quite a difficulty considering the fact that a lot of people didn't have formal qualifications, didn't have the necessary social networks, and the kind of skills development that they were offered tended to be lower skilled. The support for former coal mining communities did come, but with a caveat that it came quite late. Most of these projects came in the 1990s. So the first 4 are specifically from the UK, and this was offered during the new Labour government rather than the Thatcher government or the subsequent major government, which were both Conservative governments. ReCHAR was an EU programme. This tried to funnel both the European Social Funds and European Regional Development Funds into the coal mining sectors, and this had some levels of success, but the fact that it came at a delayed time after a couple of years after the mine closures meant that its impact was to be limited. So the kind of the key points of lessons that could be learned from the case of Wakefield is the fact that when key stakeholders don't have an aligned goal, this can have detrimental impacts in order to support the individuals. Lack of recognition that coal mining industries and communities needed specific support meant that holistic support was non-existent in the case of Wakefield. Delayed responses that came in the 1990s also meant that there were some limitations in what it could have achieved. So in the case of CISAC Croatia, it has a relatively high unemployment rate. To start off with 90%, it is much higher than the national average. And also it's a rapidly aging and declining population. And in terms of the oil refinery, it peaked in 1980s. The operating company is the INA. It's private, it has been privatized, but 45% of it is still nationally owned. So there is some scope of the government interventions. And now, after the oil refinery closure, it is trying to be converted to a biorefinery. In terms of higher education providers, it's quite limited. As far as I can see, there's only one faculty, which is the Faculty of Metallurgy of the University of Zagreb, located in Sisak. It has about 29 people graduating per year, 141 students. It's the smallest faculty within the University of Zagreb. So there's limitations in what the higher education providers can do in order to re-educate and retrain the population. Logistics has actually been identified by consultancy firms as a way to move forward. However, I'd like to also point out that in the case of Wakefield, a quite substantive proportion of the residents are employed in the logistics sector, but they are having difficulties due to, as I said before, low pay, lack of skills, limited career prospects, and also the dangerous mechanization. So now we are talking about these jobs potentially being automated, and again, a cycle of the loss of jobs that we'll be potentially be seeing. So coming back to the just transition process from non-green jobs to becoming unemployed, but successfully being retrained and then entering into green jobs is going to be quite difficult. And instead, this is not the most well-developed process that I've come up with. And I'd like to ask the audience for some feedback, comments in order to how to improve. I'd say that the main stakeholders, you should have the key main stakeholders having an aligned goal of interest. So I put businesses there, but in the case of in both countries with business interests, also in the national government interest will be quite important. Probably in order to transition from non-green jobs to retraining, they should have been done at the same time. So while people are still being employed in these non-green sectors, they should have been retrained and re-educated. If this wasn't the case, perhaps some kind of maintenance loans to support people during their education. And then in order to transition to green jobs, identifying the fact that CISAC has relatively limited other job prospects, perhaps it would be wise to support people in moving out of the region potentially, and then supporting them through providing accommodation and transportation support as well. This was actually the case that was done in the case of my home country, Japan, where we did give out some funds to former coal miners in order for them to move out of the region to gain re-employment. So lastly, I'd like to point out the political consequence of inaction. So Wakefield voted quite substantively in support for Brexit. 66.4% of its residents did vote in support. And while the residents didn't actually view the EU as having been directly responsible for the relative decline, it is also a sign that if these kinds of socioeconomic damages aren't fully addressed, that it could have a wider political consequence, not just at the local level, but at the national level. For instance, they voted, thank you, they voted for the Conservative Party for the first time in 80 years. So while I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, it is a sign of a seismic move or in terms of the political landscape, and therefore a failed just transition has the potential of having a long-term, wider consequences. So in terms of the conclusion, I'll say that the failed just transition has caused a long-term relative decline in the case of Wakefield. And as in the previous session, Alessandra mentioned that we need to be looking into more of the endemic kind of challenges that local authorities face. This is definitely the case of Wakefield. Some of the kind of interventions, for instance, trying to encourage entrepreneurship, had quite limited impact due to the existing difficulties in terms of skills and education qualifications, and also considering the negative impact of unemployment and its long-term consequences, perhaps intervene as early as possible while people are still in employment in a declining sector would be quite important. And also that all stakeholders, key stakeholders, should have an aligned, at least short-term goal as well. And also there's a limited role at the moment in regions like Wakefield or CISAC in these regions for the higher education sector to play. And therefore we need to recognize these difficulties and challenges. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity.
Stay a little bit, because on second thought, I mean, having a common discussion, the room is not really suitable for that as now. I mean, I can't invite all the speakers to the stage, it's just too small. So if you have more than just specific questions for Sarah, then we can have just a few minutes to raise them up. Any reactions from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
There's a microphone behind you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Milad Abbas from the University of Groningen. I found this transition from non-green to green jobs very interesting. I'm wondering whether you have a narrative or an example from your case, how it happened, how it worked out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So for in the case of Wakefield, it was quite difficult to find them being able to transition successfully into green job sectors. And of course, it happened at first back in the 1980s and 1990s when we were still not talking about these green jobs. But I think that the difficulty in people finding new job opportunities, especially when you need to have higher levels of education qualifications, skill sets, longer term training, means that it's quite unlikely that people will be able to successfully make that transition unless there's substantive intervention. So I think that's the kind of lesson that can be learned and applied to the transition from non-green to green jobs. Thank you.
I have a question myself. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting for cohesion policy to learn from the examples of the past. And I also reckon that in the 80s and 90s, when across Europe coal mines have been shut down, there were no sort of green jobs to replace them, and now we do have them. Anyway, I like your scheme that you presented and on which we could reflect. I'm come from Belgium. We had a coal mine region called Limburg on the border with the Netherlands and Germany in the east of the country, which was then also closed in the 80s and 90s. And one way of sort of institutionalizing the stakeholder component of your scheme was to apply what we called an intendant, so a person or a small group of people that actually tries to engage and bring together all the different stakeholders to come to a consensus. So I mean, with mixed outcomes, of course, because you need to first gain trust of all the parties, and if you are a government representative who has shut down the coal mines, you don't necessarily have that. Maybe any experiences on such an approach in the UK or in the Croatian region?
Yeah, Thank you so much for that. The example of Belgium was very interesting, and I think that in terms of Wakefield, at least, there wasn't that much cooperation, as you point out. The government was seen as the ones responsible for having closed down the coal mines, and the National Coal Board was also responsible for operating the mines, were also seen as responsible for not having had. There were speculations that the head of the National Coal Board was too close to the national government, and with the trade unions movements, they were also able to go with that narrative, which made it extremely difficult for any kind of cooperation. So in the case of Wakefield and the wider coal mining communities of that time, that kind of cooperations, I don't think happened, or was quite difficult because of the personal clashes at the very top. In case of CISAC, the trade union communities seems to be having a less prominence. I think it's happening in all of the world, but trade unions are losing their memberships and losing their political influence as well. So they have been petitioning to try to stop the coal mine, the oil refinery closures, or people being made redundant. But it seems that they've had fairly limited influence in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very nice presentation. And I would like to pick up, my name is Michael Kuhl, I'm from the Natural Resources Institute, Finland. On your point on education, I found that very interesting and relevant. Also, we are soon presenting a paper on the Just Transition Fund in Finland, and there one of the issues that the DG Radio was looking at was the kind of the quality of re-education, or is there enough capacity of re-education for the people? In our case, it's the peat sector. And but primarily then what they were looking at was not at the level of higher education as you presented, but at the level of University of Applied Sciences, but also vocational schools. And then my question would be, how did you also look at that aspect? And the second point, in my previous work, I was working for the Nordic Collaboration, so Nordic Council of Ministers, in very remote places like Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And I found very interesting aspects of kind of remote education, and also in the higher sector. So in the Faroe Islands, very remote from the capital, Tórshavn, and they had some agreements with University of Copenhagen for education, providing education in the remotest islands. So is that also some kind of issue that you might think could be implemented? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, the question. Actually, I didn't talk about this in this presentation, but actually vocation training was something that I was quite interested in as well. So the problem with the UK's vocational system is that it tends to have been quite difficult in terms of people getting that experience. So at present, we actually have maintenance loans for students going into the higher education sector. So regardless of your background, you are able to get this government loan in order to gain a university level education. The problem with the vocational system is that it doesn't exist, and we expect that people will be paid for their time because you are working part-time and studying part-time. The problem here is that with the vocational system in the UK, the minimum wage is £4, about £4 per hour. That's half the minimum wage that of a normal worker. And I've made some very simple calculations based on if you are residing in Wakefield and if you try to live on your own, based on that income for the number of hours, the minimum hours of work that you'll be doing, you'll probably be left with a couple of pounds at best to survive on, which is not enough. And therefore, it's quite likely that you need to have your friends and family supporting you during your time of apprenticeships. It's almost impossible for a person to be doing a vocational training while living on their own. You have to have that kind of family support. And increasingly, we are seeing vocational training where people are applying for them tend to be quite old. So the highest increase in the number of people starting vocational training is at age 25 or older. So it's quite likely that these people have already gone through some kind of educational qualification or some kind of work and then going into these kind of training programs. So we're not seeing people who are 16, 17 just left compulsory education and joining these institutions. So there is a problem in terms of the available opportunities. And another point is that vocational training tends to be seen as relatively easy for people with limited academic background, but we have a minimum requirement of certain GCSE scores, which is the scores for high school students. And if you don't meet that minimum score, you can't even get on to become a plumber. In the Wakefield region, quite substantive number of people actually don't meet that basic requirement. So from before you get to that vocational training stage, students are being let down by the current education system in order to achieve that basic qualification. So we do have quite a bit of issues there. And in the point about being rural, Wakefield is quite rural, but I think compared to the other regions, it's relatively well connected. So that's my final point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And best of luck with your PhD. There's water if you need a drink, so take it here. So our next speaker is Professor Mike Woods. He is a professor of human geography at the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences in Aberystwyth. Do I pronounce that correctly? That's in Wales. And he will speak about spatial justice and territorial cohesion in Europe, scenarios for 2050.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I find here we are. Good. Yeah, so I'm thinking that in many ways I'm going to be building on some of the discussions in the plenary this morning. In fact, our starting point for this talk is, as we all know, that territorial cohesion is enshrined as a core principle for the European Union, and that there has been uneven and discontinuous patterns of convergence, and that also we're seeing more recently some of the principles underlying territorial cohesion and cohesion policy are being challenged by Eurosceptic, populist, and separatist movements, such that the future of territorial cohesion in the European Union cannot be taken for granted. So in this presentation, I want to just briefly introduce a spatial justice perspective on territorial cohesion as a way of looking at this, to take stock of the current position, and then to outline 4 scenarios for territorial cohesion and spatial justice in the EU of 2050. I'm drawing here upon a recently completed Horizon 2020 project, Imagine, which is focused on addressing territorial inequalities and spatial justice in Europe. This was a consortium of 15 partners, including MICO, amongst others, as an interdisciplinary project with a number of different foci in work packages and a mixed methods approach to our evidence and analysis. And in this talk this morning, I'm going to draw a little bit on some of the economic analysis which was done, to also draw upon the panel survey, which had just over 18,000 respondents across 8 different European countries, but mainly to draw upon this final box here of the scenario development and training. But let me start by saying a bit more about spatial justice as the lens through which we explored this issue. And I've taken a definition here from one of our sibling projects in the same call under Horizon 2020, Relocal, and they define spatial justice as being about focusing on both the just geographic distribution of resources and opportunities and on the power relations that cause injustice between social groups and between spaces. So as a concept, spatial justice has roots both in the radical urban geography of writers such as David Harvey and ideas of territorial justice in the late 1960s and 1970s, and then in Henri Lefebvre's concept of the right to city. It has since then been largely developed in an urban context, notably by Ed Soldier in the United States, But more recently, we've been seeing this application to regional scale context, and partly driven by this particular Horizon 2020 call. In part because it's had this bifurcated origins, spatial justice isn't necessarily a unified theory, but has different, slightly different perspectives embodied within it. And one of the things we did in the Imagine project was try to expand the concept of spatial justice and to elaborate a multidimensional model as identified here. So the different dimensions we have within this. Firstly, that spatial justice perhaps its most simplistic level is about the distribution of resources across geographical space, but it's also about the fairness of policy and decision-making processes that produce those distributions. In other words, the spatial distribution of power. It's additionally about the capability of an individual or a social group to participate in the processes that shape space and exert an influence over the production of the spaces in which they spend their everyday lives. And this is the kind of Lefebvrean idea of the right to the city or the right to the region as we've expanded it. But spatial justice also takes us from a quantitative measurement of inequalities to a qualitative assessment of what is just, what is fair. And that therefore brings in the dimension of perception. So spatial justice is also about perceived inequalities or perceived fairness, unfairness across and between spaces, which may or may not correspond to quantitative measurements of observed material distributions. And finally, we can also see spatial justice as a normative idea, not just describing whether something is or is not just, but also articulating what justice might look like. So when we apply this across to looking at territorial inequalities in the EU at present and the impacts of cohesion policy, we can come up with a number of conclusions. So firstly, we've found that there was a discernible trajectory of narrowing disparities between regions in Europe over the last 3 decades, but with a number of caveats. And these, again, are not necessarily new. I think they're reinforcing much of the evidence which in the 8th cohesion report, for example. But that firstly, that we saw a very clear trend of convergence up to 2008. It was disrupted by the economic crisis, and it's taken time to recover. So the last decade, we've seen a far more heterogeneous pattern of convergence of that period. Secondly, that convergence has been most pronounced in a closing of middle ranking regions, rather than at the extremes, the most and least affluent regions. And we do identify with that some emerging pockets of persistent disadvantage. And thirdly, that the closing of within region inequalities has frequently been slower than reductions in between region disparities. So this again raises the question of scale, which is touched on the plenary. And just one illustration of this, one item of work within Imagine was to disaggregate some of the data from NUTS 2 down to the local scales. Well, that local scale data wasn't necessarily equivalently available across the European Union. And this, for example, shows mean household income disaggregated to local scale. And you see, you can compare that to the figures at NUTS 2 regions. You get a much more granulated pattern here, including rural-urban distinctions. Second key finding, European territorial cohesion policies have had an impact in narrowing interregional inequalities. But again, the effect of specific instruments is variegated geographically and over time. So higher levels of structural funds investment, for example, are associated with the pre-2004 states, with narrowing of inequalities within regions, but had less impact on regional economic growth. In the post-2004 states, on the other hand, we see a positive influence on regional economic growth, but also exacerbation of within region inequalities. And we also additionally note that it's not just European Union policy here. National fiscal transfer policies have also been important, but again, have differential impacts. Thirdly, public perceptions of inequalities between regions and relative economic development or quality of services are not always consistent with quantitative indicators. And we picked this up through the panel survey we did of these 8 countries here. So one of the questions we asked was whether respondents considered that their region had benefited more or less than other regions from European funding. And on the map on the left there, the pinks and the purples and the oranges are the regions where over half respondents said that their region had benefited less from EU funding than other EU regions. And what stands out there is that includes regions in parts of Poland, in Romania, in southern Italy, in parts of Spain, which actually are amongst the highest level of regions in terms of structural fund eligibility. Fourth, there's broad public support for the principle of solidarity between regions, but also with significant national and regional variations. So the preferences for the scale at which solidarity is exercised vary and are influenced by perceptions of deservingness of recipient regions, perceptions of political competence and corruption and so on. And this then helps to shape these ideas of spatial injustice and whether or not regions feel they're being treated fairly, both in terms of the support they get from cohesion policy, but also in terms of the contributions they're making to cohesion policy and where that funding is ending up. And those perceptions of spatial justice you see feeding through into support for populist, Eurosceptic and territorial autonomy movements, which then presents a challenge to ideas of solidarity and cohesion at a European scale and the capacities for redistribution. This is again from the panel survey. We asked whether the priority should be on helping other regions within the same country, other lagging regions within the European Union as a whole, or on a global scale, less developed countries globally. And what we see here is a higher levels for transfers within the European Union in countries like Romania and Spain and Italy. But you then look at the UK, you look at Germany and France, and especially the Netherlands, which stands out here. The preference is very much for keeping that support within the nation state, the member state. And on the question of how this feeds into territorial autonomy movements, we look more at territorial autonomy movements rather than Eurosceptic movements. But this was looking at how they frame their demands and documentation. And in some, we see it's about socioeconomic inequality emphasized, but in others, generally the wealthier regions, Catalonia, Bavaria, Northern Italy, or Northern Italy and Bavaria in particular in this one, it was about political arguments, about political justice, including arguments fiscal autonomy and holding on to their own wealth. So where does this take us looking forward? So building on that kind of research we did looking at the current state of territorial inequality and special justice in Europe, we then started to project ahead what this might look like over the next 4 EU planning rounds. So that takes you on 7-year periods to 2048, and we, for this presentation, rounded that up to 2050. We did this with a participating scenario building methodology, starting with a virtual working group of members of our consortium who've been involved in different areas of the work. And from this, we elaborated, identified the kind of political ecosystem and the issues we just did, identified 2 axes, and then populating and elaborating each of these 4 resulting scenarios. We then went out to various foresight experts in a number of different institutions and tested in workshops with, again, a further other institutions, both in Europe and elsewhere. We had workshops with regional and national level stakeholders and external reviews by 16 experts in different fields to elaborate these scenarios. And then with the final versions, we've also then gone back to workshops in Greece, Ireland, Poland, so Romania and Wales, with, again, regional and national stakeholders and discussing the implications and applications of the scenarios. So this is what we've got in terms of scenarios. We've got it along 2 axes, and these axes are both continuums rather than opposites, but one is between a high level of solidarity and centralization in Europe, underpinning European politics, and the other is high levels of regional autonomy. And then the horizontal axis is between an emphasis wholly on economic growth and prosperity at one end, and at the other end, a broader emphasis on social and environmental well-being, in which economic growth is relegated as less significant. And from that, we then populated these scenarios in the 4 corners, which I'll just take you through now. So the Silver Citadel scenario is one which perhaps feels most familiar to us now. It's one in which actually you managed to achieve not only greater prosperity, but also more economic equity by 2050. But that's happened through the consolidation of decision-making power and even more centralized structures underpinning territorial cohesion. That includes a unified EU tax and welfare system. Material inequalities have therefore receded, leveling ahead of GDP and supported by AU, use of artificial intelligence. And in this, we're driving towards spatial justice as understood as the equitable distribution of wealth between regions. But at the same time, there's perceptions of spatial injustice where the centralization of decision making is seen to have excluded individuals from regions from making control decisions over their own resources and taxation and so on. In the second scenario, we again see the EU consolidating its powers to monitor and regulate resilience and sustainability to survive the climate change and other crises. We imagine a Europe that's been quite significantly disrupted here, sea level change leaving some coastal regions being abandoned, cities perhaps falling out of favor because of repeated pandemics, rural areas becoming more valued, and therefore European structural funds are no longer distributed according to GDP, but an assessment of social and environmental threats and needs and success measured by a range of well-being indicators. Common agricultural policy has been replaced by common food and health policy, there's climate reparations, and here spatial justice means regions helping each other to adapt and change. So the institutional coherence of the EU regions has been strengthened through centralization of decision-making, but new significant territorial inequalities have emerged. The third scenario, the Silicon Scaffold, is a Europe which consists in 2050 of digital relationships in a world shaped by transnational corporations. City-states and regions with corporate affiliations have come to the fore and developed their own authority. And the roots of this was richer regions growing dissatisfied with the EU mechanisms of redistributing resources and demanding more autonomy, which leads to an erosion of wealth redistribution and the state's role in providing public services being replaced by transnational corporations filling that gap. In wealthier regions, that means global tech companies signing deals to provide health, education, and transport services in return for access to data. In less developed regions, it means becoming dependent on mining, energy, agri-food companies that invest in service and infrastructure in terms of access to natural resources and agricultural resources. We also imagine here that there's more digital citizenship. So actually, you can actually buy citizenship of a different state if you want to access that digitally. So that actually, to some degree, separates social rights and spatial rights. Spatial justice here is therefore the right of regions to hold on to the wealth they've generated, but the territorial cohesion of the EU had been sacrificed for the growth of wealthier regions. And then finally, the patchwork rainbow is one in which European society has been ruptured by polarizing culture wars. The EU is now fragmented into semi-autonomous nations, regions, communities, founded on distinct cultural values. Independence in Scotland and Catalonia is a domino effect, with other regions becoming separate or radical decentralization in surviving nation states. And therefore, we get nations and regions becoming increasingly autonomous with different cultural values guiding them, from religious social conservatism through to progressive cosmopolitanism, through radical environmentalism, creating territorial inequalities. So there's substantial migration within Europe as people move to align with cultural values, but we also see a pattern of economic decline, increased care costs, reduced tax take from a contracting working age population, eroding the welfare state, and responsibility for welfare and public services, increasing rest in voluntary and community-based groups shaped by these dominant self-defined values of the regions and territories. So spatial justice here, the community's right to define their own values, but territorial cohesion at a European scale has become meaningless, albeit still perhaps has some meaning within nations and regions. So these four scenarios are consciously polarized, extreme versions of the future. They're not intended to be a menu of options. And ultimately, the Europe of 2050 is likely to lie in somewhere between these. But they are intended to capture plausible trajectories of change that are rooted in developments we already see existing today. And they do all present further questions for EU cohesion policy. So the civil citadel, for example, is closest to conventional EU thinking. Imagining spatial justice as equitable distribution of resources being achieved at the price of centralisation. So this outcome may be more economically just, but for many EU citizens, the means of achieving it could be regarded as unjust. Green Guardian is an extension, of course, of Green Recovery or a Green New Deal or the Just Transition. It imagines a fundamental shift in societal priorities, the conflict of climate change and other crises. Territorial cohesion in the shape of a pan-European solidarity to help regions adjust to these crises, but it also involves new territorial politics with clear winners and losers. And then Silicon Scaffold and Patrick Rainbow both anticipate a rollback of political commitments to EU territorial cohesion in response to demands for territorial autonomy. So the Scaffold perhaps builds on some of the Brexit logic in the UK, taking back control of economic growth. But that combination can only be achieved in a few highly connected city regions, with more regions becoming highly marginalised and dependent on transnational corporations. And then finally, Patrick Rainbow is inspired in part by the kind of cultural tensions we see between the European Commission and socially conservative governments in Hungary and Poland at the moment. And this seems to offer little hope for European territorial cohesion, as it challenges the very notion of shared European identity, self-purpose. But we perhaps could see some states still, therefore, moves towards economic cohesion if they were just decoupled from cultural and political agendas. So the final slide, in terms of conclusions, what we've trying to show through this is that a multifaceted character of spatial justice highlights the trade-offs that are inherent in EU cohesion policy. It's not inevitable, therefore, that the principles currently embedded in cohesion policy will hold over the next 3 decades, but neither is there any single indisputed normative ideal of spatial justice that can guide territorial cohesion. And what we therefore say is that there needs to be a debate in Europe about what form of spatial justice should be prioritised and how EU policies can best work towards that goal. And the capacity of Europe to arrive at some kind of consensus around that will itself test or whether meaningful territorial cohesion can be achieved.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, this is evidently very relevant. We are also setting up a process in as the commissioner announced on the post-27 cohesion policy that starts with the next work group and with more work. And I mean, in this slide, these scenarios are very helpful. I think I would out myself as a Green Guardian, actually, but I mean, I also have a history in biodiversity science. So any questions for Mike? I just yeah, okay.
Thank you, Mikko Wegrud from the National Resource Institute. Thanks for the great presentation, and nice to hear what has happened in Imagine since I left. I was actually working in the first work package, the conceptual one. And also, I think the scenarios are very useful in general for the science policy interface, and I'm so happy to see every time when I see it. I think that should be kind of even mandatory for each project to have it, because they give clear goals for the policy process. But I have a small question about the theme, which I'm personally interested in. In one of the, was it work package number 4, you made a survey on how individuals in regions think whether they are getting less or more EU funding, and then you showed a picture with the distribution in a map. Did you actually model the effect of each regional funding on the individual person, because whether it has an effect, because in technical terms it can be done. And it's because we all know that this geography of this content has a paradox, where the most money goes, they are the people who are most opposed to EU. So did you actually model this, and did you find anything interesting?
It's not been, we haven't modeled it exactly yet. I think we're still working on some of those results, and I think that bit of trying to model more precisely, to say the actual investment per person versus those perceptions would be an interesting thing to do statistically to do that. So I think that's something we can we can try to do. And I'll just add to that, 'cause I think that's, some of this is ongoing. So there is a more detailed written version of this talk. I'm not sure you can get through the app, but I'm happy to send that to anyone who's interested. And also on the Imagine website we had up there is more detailed versions of scenarios, the response to that, as well as a policy briefing with policy recommendations. I've got a couple of copies of those with me, but they're also on the website. And again, I'm happy to email those to anyone. But we're also finally in the process now of writing a vote from this, which will also give the opportunity to explore some of those questions further, which should be coming out open access with Edward Elgar next year. So I think lots of these things we're still trying to work in a bit more to join up the dots between some of these different parts of the project. And particularly the questions about links to geographies of discontent, which I think are valuable questions we need to explore a bit more.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Once again, thank you. Keep us informed also about the outcome. So I mean, we are very, very interested in that. Then we come to the final presentation of today. This is by Mikko Wekrot and by Michael Kull. They are scientists at the Natural Resource Institute in Finland, also called LUKE, right? The title sort of provides interesting clues about the musical preferences of one or both of the researchers, but I'm sure they can explain themselves. I'll just say it here: and justice, peace, and prosperity for all, seeking distributive, procedural, and recognitive spatial justice from the just transition mechanism in Finland. So I invite you both to the floor.
Thank you, dear moderator. As noted, we are sharing the presentations with my colleague Michael Kull. For some obvious reasons, we have quite many slides, and he's the fastest speaker in our institute. He can say 400 words in a minute, so it's really justified. I will open this up, and then Michael will give you the empirical story, and then I will wrap it up at the end. Very briefly, the structure, first starting obviously with the research questions, which we want to answer, then the strategy, how do we are going to do it. In one picture, the key components, kind of the literatures or debates we are merging into one article or analysis. In one slide, very brief literature, what has already been written about the JTF. It's relatively new, but there are some academic research already on it. Then the empirical parts, then the 3 key points, which is always good to have in the presentations. If you don't remember anything else, remember then, and then the usual conclusions part. What did we actually set out to do? We are interested to see how well does the JTF address distributive, procedural, and recognitive justice, especially in a Finnish context. I hope and I assume you are relatively familiar with these distributive different dimensions of justice, but if not, we will go there slightly more in detail in the next slide. Another research question is that we wanted to disclose the process of policy transfer from the Commission to the national, to the regional, the normal multi-level governance framework in the context of GTF. And especially we are targeting 2 regions in Finland, North and South Karelia. And this is also, I need to mention, it's work in a process. We have yet to do the interviews in the North Karelia and also in the European Union level. How review of the JTF documents, again, national level, regional level, and also the academic literature. And as I said, we are doing interviews and we are in the process of doing more interviews. So this is about halfway maybe on the empirical part. Results, academic article usually is the result, and maybe policy brief. Let's see where this takes us. I don't know if we can draft the scenarios here, but let's see. This is the big picture I promised, kind of the 3 debates we are dealing with. Obviously, we are studying the JTF, which we all know what it aims, kind of the similar agenda as the whole cohesion policy, with a quite ambitious and kind of noble agenda of leaving no person, no region behind. It's good agenda, even though it's of course not totally realistic. It gives us a direction. Then we have just transition literature, which usually distinguish between 3 dimensions of justice. Distributive is kind of refers only to mechanical allocation of resources between different partners. Procedural refers to the processes, whether all the stakeholders are involved in the process of the decision making. And recognitive is kind of the place-based, place-sensitive, kind of that the bottom-up approach, that the locally defined meaning of well-being process and local values are recognized. So in general, I think this is very useful frame for all the policymakers and scientists to evaluate any case of a just transition or cases of justness or injustice. Third part, the places that don't matter debate. It's obviously a partner here as well. And that also can be divided into different categories. That the uneven economic geography is kind of the very basic spatial nature of economy. It's not the world is not flat in economic terms. But then again, something I always try to emphasize is the subjective dimension, that it's geography of political agency is something which we have been studied. So it's about the subjective perceptions of justice, not the macroeconomic divergence between the regions, because it's all about the people and their emotions. And then again, locally defined well-being and development, reference to the Imagine project as well, is also a key component. And these are actually linked together quite nicely, kind of uneven economic distributive, the political agency, whether the people are actually part of the process, and the recognitive is the place-sensitive approach. This is the framework which we are operating in. Just briefly, this kind of, I have done with my previous colleague analysis, which kind of combines these environmental justice and the places left behind thesis in a single article. And the results are kind of quite alarming or concerning, because there really is urban, rural, and growing lagging regions division in the attitudes toward climate change. That's the beginning. I think actually we skip this, and I hand it over to Mihail.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so let's. I would like to invite you on a journey into the multi-level governance of this JTF programming, Just Transition Fund programming. And before we go to this journey, we need to a little bit set the scene by seeing who are the key players in this on this journey. So if we start at the regional level, we have in Finland we have the regional councils. So they are 18 plus then the Åland Islands. They are joint municipal authorities in charge of regional development and regional planning. Then we have at the national level, we have the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, who is in charge of regional development, the island policy, and also the integration of regional policy into rural policy. And then at the EU level, we have DG Regio. So, and we will hear a little bit how this interplay between these 3 levels has worked out. But before we go into this, let's have a quick look into the current situation with the national regional programs. So both the national JTF program and all the 14 regional programs have been approved by the Finnish government in October 22, and they were sent to the Commission for approval. The signal that came back was that they should be approved rather quickly. probably they are already now as we talk. And the plan is that the regions can start with the implementation in the spring of 23. Finland used to be among the leading countries back in the late 2020, early 21. But now we are in the middle and we dropped out a little bit here, and we will hear a story or some first indications why this was. So a lot of twists and turns of collecting data, opinions, and so on has been found on the way. So the focus in Finland and the JTF is peat, is the energy use of peat. And this was mainly motivated by the central government's commitment to reduce the energy use of peat by 50% until 2030. The expectations are that the decrease is even higher, and current estimations are by some regions that the production consumption could end almost completely already by 24. So while the JTF program is still on its way. Peat peaked in the early 2000s. It was about 7% of total energy consumption in Finland. And then it dropped down to about 5% in the 2010 years. And interestingly, we compare a little bit the other energy use forms in the other JTF benefiting countries, such as Estonia or neighboring countries. So they focus on oil shale, which is about 75% of Estonia's energy production, and approximately 60% of the final energy consumption. So it's quite different figures that we are talking about. But then again, if you look at the regional level, in the region that has the most use, it's the region of South Ostrobothnia, where the share was about 63%. In terms of job development, overall, it's also fairly marginal. So our case country, or that we have started to focus on, it's South Karelia. It's on the right side. We are now down to about 25 jobs approximately. The highest is in North Ostrobothnia. We are a bit over 220, and in Finland as a whole, the job is 1,066 at current level. So if we would break down the funding per head, and then it would be around €1 million for a person that would get retraining, if it would be just JTF. But we come to that discussion later on. So if we start our journey in two and a half years back, so as our interview from the national ministry said, so nobody really knew at the beginning what this JTF is all about. And also if you look into the literature that has been written about this, so this is kind of resonates with that as well. And we ask, of course, why was this focus on peat? So because it's the job level is minimal, and also the share as energy use was little. And it was clearly stated that this focus came from the Commission because of as I said earlier, the Finnish government's program's commitment to reduce energy peat. So it was a good entry point, so that there was a commitment, so we can follow up. And that was why the Commission wanted to link JTF to this commitment. There was already some, at that time, two and a half years back, some problems that were envisioned by our national ministry. So the peat focus is a very political question of importance. And they thought this will become difficult in the view of different stakeholders, but also the regional targeting later on. Then we have to focus on peat, the high focus on peat. That will be a real catastrophe. And will we see that the regions could use all the money later on? Quickly on this, the travel itinerary. So it was supposed to, it started quite well in the late 2020. Positive signs on draft regional plans already, and the idea was that probably we could already start with a call for applications for projects already in the autumn of 21, but it became quite different. And now, as I said earlier, the programs are with the Commission for a final approval, and we could probably start with the implementation in spring. No, it's wrong, in spring 23. So let's take a little walk into the multi-level governance of that. So starting first with the national and EU level relations, which can be maybe summarized as waiting for clear instructions. So this was probably the key message we received from our national ministry. So whilst in the preparations, so everybody was quite excited about that, but overall this was kind of withering away quite quickly, because they lacked clear instructions on how this could be actually treated. So we didn't progress. They were so unsure, so in the Commission, what they can tell us about that. And the hardest part that was felt on behalf of the national ministry was that the different positions from from the DGs Regio and Climate. So so one says it like that and the other differently. So kind of a lack of coordination here. So it was perceived as a very heavy process and also a lack of leadership on the way. And sorry to say that, but say that Regio, they said, was rather weak in this, and also DG Climate's role in that sense difficult, and one could hardly follow the actions regarding to the advice given on the way. But then, I mean, member states find ways, and there was a kind of a informal exchange or collaboration with other EU member states to exchange how they were probably pushed into certain themes, and then as a positive sign, the national desk, which was very helpful. And here the informality of policy making, very, very important. So trying to understand what's going on. Then multi-level governance type 2, so the national and regional level relationship, so which can be summarized as kind of handbrake turns on the way. This was again, or this was mainly from the regional stakeholders, but also the national level said, okay, you will probably hear the story when you talk to them. So the first message was that JTF is just transition money that is focused on regions phasing out peat, but you don't have to establish any direct links to peat whatsoever. But then after the first regional draft plans have been submitted, then they had to state strict links to peat and measures linked to peat. So kind of a abrupt turn. Then now in summer of 22, in addition to this peat links, there was also regional programs had to state how green transition is tackled and also how possibly the environmental energy impacts can be measured. And then finally, close to the submission, some technical things of cutting long text and the fear of losing probably some important issues that were covered. So the bottom line that was drawn that in general terms, it worked quite well, the collaboration, but the guidelines changed fairly often. So where can we find the reason here? What is the problem probably? And then we thought a little back to Professor Ian Bache, famous gatekeeping term. So maybe there was some gatekeeping taking place at the national level. So kind of a filtering between the regions and the EU Commission, and that was kind of confirmed by the region. So they felt that maybe the stricter requirements from the Commission that came were caused by the national ministry. So that it was their fault to restrict regional programs because of own interest, to make it simpler, keep it easy, yes, and probably the Commission would have provided more space to use support activities wider, and the EU and the Commission having had a wider repertoire, for instance, in relation to indicators, individual measures for funding, but the national ministry wanted to have it simple, reduce priorities and support measures. The social aspect. So overall, one interim conclusion is that peat has been an entrance card to this JTF program development. And at the beginning, the guidelines were given from the ministry was that about 25% of each regional plan should have social fund measures there, but the regions wanted only about 10%. Our case study, the South Karelia, wanted to have about 15% because of the felt risk of social exclusion and the fairly low education levels of people in the peat sector, and especially in this rural peat community. So giving money for retraining education measures, and in addition to the JTF, there will be also the social climate fund coming. But importantly here is that the JTF does not support individual peat entrepreneurs or individuals directly. And yes, so how our ministry concluded this, so at the end of the day, the expectation is that it makes just the same as the other funds, ERDF and ESF. There was no need for this new funding instrument on their behalf. And in terms of program implementation, peat probably has no meaning anymore, not even the call for applications for the JTF funds have to relate to peat. So the three key points to take away. So the focus on people and social aspects is rather weak. So there's not direct links, as I said earlier. So there has no be direct links probably. We will see what the program implementation brings. But at the moment, as we could identify, there was no big link to that. The national ministry concluded that it didn't bring us anything, this new instrument, but a considerable amount of extra work and administrative confusion. So maybe some lessons to learn for the future programmatic periods. And the experienced person from the regional level who has been since the beginning, since Finland joined the EU in this program, regional programming, said is really a category of its own. All these changes, also sudden ones, took place several times. So this was kind of rather radical lesson learned. And Mikko, you will conclude.
Yes. I will wrap things up. Starting with the question which we started with. How well does the JTF address the dimension of justice? Well, not that well. Concerning the distributive, yes, money is still allocated on regional basis, but slightly with different mechanisms than the other regional fundings. So it does address just as well as normal or conventional regional money, but there's nothing specific on that. Concerning the procedural, it didn't go that well either, because the PEAT was already locked at the national level. Kind of the regional players didn't have much to say, even though they had to make the regional plans, of course. Recognitive, again, not that well. Yeah, this is kind of the obvious. The capacity of JTF to address the places that don't matter, and I'm speaking mostly from the subjective side, whether this kind of relieves the anti-EU and anti-establishment's attitudes toward the rural population in general. Well, no, because first of all, it's so marginal. There are 20 people employed in South Carolina. It doesn't really show up there either. Try to make a reference to the previous Imagine project, kind of reflections to the interviews we did there on the territorial cohesion and the commissioners, how they perceive the territorial cohesion. There we observed that there has been, at least in the narrative, how the territorial cohesion is presented, a shift from the GDP to well-being. But this has obviously not transferred to the JTF, unfortunately. As a final remarks, I'd like to kind of emphasize the importance of trying to really build the subjective feeling of justness in the transition, because in a democratic societies, that's the only option. If the people see the policy measures unfair, we have seen that they will start to vote parties which actually reject the whole need for the transaction. They don't seek for more just mechanisms. They kind of deny the whole importance of this. In that sense, in a democratic societies, the transition needs to be just, or it doesn't happen at all. Very final point. Unfortunately, there's kind of a lot of criticism, not from us, but kind of coming from our data. But then again, it would be nice to offer kind of suggestions or ways forward. And we are still in the process, so we have these data or impressions from the regions and national level, but we are yet to analyze kind of how did this went wrong and that could be improved. But something we have been talking is that, for example, Mihail has been working a lot with the new leader programs that could have kind of applied or used to bring in the social dimension. And we close with the lyrics as observed via reference to the one song by Metallica. And let's hope that they are not singing about JTF. Most likely not, because that song was in the 80s and JTF is much newer invention. So let's try to avoid that. Thank you.
Passing actually one of my favorite albums and my favorite beach area. I wonder how much of the audience has the album of Halloween. Not so many. Anyway, questions. I don't see your hands. I just maybe I'll use the mic. I told you before I have a background as an ecologist, and I mean, for me, the including peat in the narrative of a just transition is a no-brainer actually, because peatlands, wetlands in general, I mean, they will have an essential role in climate change and how we will help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. Peatlands, they store water when there is too much, and they give us water when there is not enough. So, I mean, they are essential in the water cycle, and therefore also in how we adapt in the future to climate change and changing precipitation. But moreover, if managed well and if they are kept sufficiently wet, then peatlands absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere than forests. I mean, at rates of 2 times, 3 times the rate that forests actually sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. So I missed this point in the presentation. Maybe you consider it in your work, but I wonder in how far peat extractors can actually be trained to become managers of the peatlands and to provide a nature positive solution to climate change. Thank you.
I can start to try to answer. I think, as you said, your perspective is kind of ecological, and I'm not an expert on that. So in that sense, I'm not going to argue that peatlands are not important for the transition. Of course they are, but whether from a social scientist perspective, whether it is linked to the justness, that's kind of our negative or critical point. So in that sense, because in overall the volume in energy production and in jobs is so marginal in Finland, even those regions where it's more common. In that sense, it's a very challenging to connect it to the justice or the social aspect, even though, as you said, the peat issue needs to be included to the transition itself. But just transition, I don't know.
I would like to add, I think this is a very important point. And I think here again, we see this kind of a policy silo thinking, because I think there's a ongoing parallel discussion also ongoing in kind of a peat as wetlands and as ecosystem service providing to climate change adaptation mitigation. A lot of money is put into this also in Finland to see the potential of peat in this respect. But again, this seems to be somewhat disconnected from this whole discussion. But if you see, and we have to study also the results of the public consultation. I think many of the nature conservation organizations just put it as that. So not seeing as energy use, but see peat in a different light, not as it is constructed in the process of regional policy making and vis-a-vis the Commission and the national ministry. So I think that's the kind of that would be the key.
Yeah. Okay, but just to finish, I mean, it's a broader context. It applies to farmers as well, and how can farmers actually ensure that agricultural soils will take up more CO2? It requires a different management, but I think we can use or the experience of farmers, of peat extractors, and in such a way that they can keep on doing their job, but maybe with a slightly different twist. Mike.
Yes, thank you for that interesting talk. To what extent does peat cutting and peat use for energy in Finland have a cultural significance in rural regions, and how far is that part of thinking about a just transition? And one suggestion maybe might be interesting to look comparatively between how this has been approached in Finland and in Ireland, which is the other big country where peat has been a major source of energy. And Patrick Breshennen, for example, at Maynooth, I think has done work around environmental justice in that regard.
Maybe again I can start and Michael can complement. First of all, we only have focused on Finland at the moment, and I'm aware that Ireland is one of the countries, as you referred, where the peat is only a focus. But we haven't kind of done this comparative analysis yet. I have a slight understanding that people are more happy in the process in Ireland, but we need to work with that. But on the question how relevant, or is there kind of peat sector culture locally? We haven't digged deeper into that question as well, but I would guess that not that much. For example, comparing to assumption on Poland or kind of Poland, Eastern Europe, where the coal is so dominant, maybe in UK as well, that it kind of is source of one culture. But in Finland, the peat, as I said, in even those regions where it's more done, it's still quite marginal. They are not kind of a peat regions in that sense. So, and that again is maybe one of the source of the problems which we have. Okay.
Yeah, then just to add on that, yes, you know, the culture is probably more because you are the real Finn. I'm just the German that came in a little bit later, but also the aspect of seasonality, because the people that employed in the peat sector, they do this parts of the year, and then they go in during the winter they do different jobs. So that's also one important aspect. So these numbers that we see here that are employed, also that there's also the aspect of seasonality. So it's like people are usually, what we got is the education levels are rather low, and also there's not a high interest in this what we potentially what we got from the stories that of re-education also. So they will find their jobs. They are tractor drivers. They have their own tractor. They leave school and this, and then they will probably not be much interested in any re-education aspects either. So that's another issue here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. This morning we heard from Mr. Bock that JTF is sort of the flagship type of instrument for future cohesion policy, but I mean, on the ground we hear a slightly different story. But let's learn from that. With this, Mikko and Michael, thank you once again for this presentation, and we come to an end of this session. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for all the presenters again. So, and the session or the conference restarts at 1:45 after lunch. Thank you.